You left me to die, but the knight's on my side. Who knows just for what you've done?
Tied up and abandoned, but the knight told a different story.
Before we begin today's story, welcome to Story of the Black Past, a place where we uncover powerful and forgotten stories from history. Stories of pain, resistance, and the moments when the oppressed refuse to remain silent. If you are new here, tell us in the comments where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the time you are watching this video. We always love to see how far our stories travel across the world. If you have not yet subscribed, please subscribe and like this video. Your support helps this channel grow and allows us to continue sharing powerful history. Thank you for being here. Now relax, avoid all distractions, and pay close attention. Watch until the very end because the story you are about to hear is something you will not want to miss even for a moment. Tonight we travel to the swamps and plantations of the American South, deep in Louisiana during the harsh years of the mid-19th century. This is the story of a man whose name was barely recorded, a man whose suffering was meant to break him, but instead created something far more dangerous. A man who was tied, beaten, and left overnight by 7 men who believed he would never rise again. They were wrong. On a remote plantation surrounded by thick swamp and endless fields of sugar cane, enslaved people lived under constant control. The air was heavy with heat during the day and thick with insects at night. Work began before sunrise and ended long after the sun disappeared. Overseers watched closely, and punishment came quickly for anyone who slowed down or disobeyed. Among the enslaved workers was a man known only as Kofi. No one knew his full story. Some said he had been taken from West Africa years earlier. Others believed he had survived multiple plantations before ending up in Louisiana. What everyone knew was that Kofi was strong, quiet, and observant. He did not speak much, but he watched everything. He watched the routines of the overseers. He watched how the guards moved at night. He watched how punishments were carried out and how fear was used to control everyone on the plantation. And slowly, without anyone realizing it, he learned. Kofi had already gained the attention of the overseers before the night that would change everything. Not because he caused trouble, but because he did not break. Many enslaved men eventually showed signs of exhaustion or submission under constant pressure. But Kofi remained calm. He followed orders, but there was something in his eyes that made the overseers uneasy. It was not fear. It was something else. Something they could not control. One evening, after a long day in the fields, an overseer accused Kofi of working too slowly. The accusation was false, but that did not matter. Punishment on the plantation was not about truth, it was about control. 7 men were called. They dragged Kofi away from the field as the other workers watched in silence. No one dared to intervene. Everyone knew what was coming. They beat him. Hard. Blows landed across his back, his arms, and his face. He fell to the ground more than once, but each time they forced him back up. The beating continued until his body could no longer stand. But they were not finished. The men decided to make an example of him. They tied his hands and feet tightly with rope. Then they dragged him to the edge of the swamp, away from the main plantation buildings. There, beneath a large tree, they left him. Alone, tied, injured, and exposed to the night. The overseers believed the swamp itself would finish the job. The darkness was thick. The sounds of insects filled the air. Water moved slowly between the roots of the trees. Creatures moved unseen through the brush. No one expected Kofi to survive until morning. The 7 men walked away, confident that their work was done. But they did not understand the man they had left behind. Kofi lay on the ground, his body in pain, his breathing slow and heavy. For a long time he did not move. The night grew deeper. The sounds of the swamp surrounded him, but slowly something inside him began to rise. Pain became awareness. Awareness became focus, and focus became determination. He tested the ropes binding his hands. They were tight, but not unbreakable. The hours passed slowly. Every movement sent pain through his body, but he did not stop. He twisted his wrists carefully, ignoring the burning feeling as the rope cut into his skin. Again, and again, and again, until finally something changed. The rope loosened. It was a small movement, almost nothing, but it was enough. By the time the first light of dawn began to touch the edges of the swamp, Kofi was no longer lying helpless beneath that tree. He was free, but he was no longer the same man the 7 men had beaten and left behind. Something had changed during that night, something that would soon make them regret what they had done, because the man they thought they had broken was now thinking, planning, and waiting. And before long, the 7 men who had walked away that night would learn a lesson they would never forget. But by the time they realized it, it would already be too late. The morning sun rose slowly over the plantation in Louisiana. The fields came alive again with movement as enslaved workers were driven out to begin another long day. To the overseers, everything seemed normal. The events of the previous night had already faded from their thoughts. They believed the swamp had finished what they started. They believed the man they tied beneath that tree was gone. But they were wrong. Deep within the swamp, hidden beneath thick trees and tangled roots, Kofi moved slowly through the shadows. His body still ached from the beating. Every step brought pain. But he did not stop. He could not stop, because something inside him had changed during that night. The ropes had cut into his skin. The blows had bruised his body. But the silence of the swamp, the long hours alone between life and death, had done something deeper. It had taken away fear. What replaced it was something colder, something focused. Kofi did not rush out of the swamp. He did not run blindly through the forest. Instead, he stayed hidden. He watched. For the first few days, he survived quietly. He drank from shallow water where the ground dipped low. He gathered what little he could find. His movements were slow, careful, and deliberate. He knew the plantation would eventually realize something was wrong, and when they did, they would search. So he waited. Back on the plantation, the absence of Kofi was finally noticed. At first, the overseers dismissed it. They assumed his body would be found somewhere near the swamp. But when no remains were discovered, confusion began to grow. Then came the first sign that something was not right. One of the 7 men who had beaten Kofi reported hearing movement near his quarters late at night. He claimed someone had been watching him from the darkness. The other overseers laughed. They told him it was his imagination. But the man was not convinced. The next night, another strange event occurred. Tools went missing. Small items from the storage area disappeared without explanation. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, nothing disturbed except for the missing items. Now the overseers began to pay attention. They searched the plantation grounds but found nothing. Still, unease began to spread. Within a few more days, the situation grew worse. One of the 7 men was found injured near the edge of the field. He claimed something had struck him from behind while he was walking alone at dusk. He never saw who attacked him, but he described something that made the others uneasy. He said the attacker moved silently, like a shadow. Now the fear began to take shape. The name Kofi, once spoken casually among the workers, returned in whispers. Some enslaved people believed he was still alive. Others believed something else, something darker. The 7 men who had tied him to that tree began to feel the weight of what they had done. Because one by one, strange things continued to happen. Footprints appeared near their quarters at night, but vanished before morning. Food supplies were disturbed. Horses became restless without clear reason. And always there was the feeling of being watched. Kofi was no longer just surviving. He was learning the terrain in a new way. The swamp had become his cover. The darkness had become his ally. And the plantation that once controlled him had now become a place he moved through unseen. He knew their routines. He knew their habits. And now he used that knowledge against them. One night, as the plantation settled into silence, one of the 7 men walked alone toward the edge of the property. He never returned. By morning, his body was found near the same swamp where Kofi had been left. There were signs of struggle, but no clear explanation. The remaining men were shaken. For the first time, they began to understand. The man they had beaten, the man they had tied, the man they had left for dead, was not gone, and he was not afraid. The plantation changed quickly after that. No one moved alone at night anymore. Weapons were carried even during simple tasks. Patrols were increased, but none of it brought comfort, because the attacks did not stop. They were never loud, never obvious, but always precise, always targeted, and always connected to the same group of men. The 7, or what remained of them. Kofi was no longer the man they had once controlled. He had become something else, something they could not predict, something they could not stop. And slowly, one by one, the men who had left him to die began to understand a truth they could not escape. Some actions cannot be undone, and some mistakes return in ways no one expects. By the time they fully understood what they had created, the night had already taken its course, and the man they once thought broken had become the shadow that followed them everywhere. Waiting, watching, and making sure they never forgot what they had done. The plantation no longer felt like a place of control. It felt like a place of fear. Each day the sun still rose over the fields of Louisiana, and the work continued as it always had. Enslaved workers were still forced into the fields. Overseers still shouted orders, but something had changed beneath the surface. The balance had shifted. The remaining men who had tied Kofi to that tree no longer walked with confidence. Their voices were not as loud. Their movements were no longer careless, because now they were being watched, and they knew it. The number of the 7 had already begun to shrink. After the first man was found near the swamp, the others tried to convince themselves it was an accident. They said he had wandered too far. They said he had fallen. But deep down, they knew the truth. The second attack came only a few nights later. Another one of the men was found injured, his arm broken, his body left near the same path that led toward the swamp. He survived, but he spoke with fear in his voice when he described what happened. He said he never saw the face of the person who attacked him. Only movement. Fast. Precise. Silent. From that moment, the remaining men stopped moving alone entirely. They stayed in groups. They carried weapons even while sleeping. But none of it seemed to matter. Because Kofi was not attacking like a man in open conflict. He was attacking like someone who understood them. He knew when they were tired. He knew when they were distracted. He knew when they felt safe. And those were the moments he chose. Meanwhile, among the enslaved workers, the story was spreading. Quietly. Carefully. At night, inside cabins where whispers replaced silence, people spoke about what was happening. They spoke about the man who had been beaten, the man who had been tied and left in the swamp, the man who had returned. But they did not speak about him with fear. They spoke about him with something else. Respect. Because in a place where resistance was often punished before it could even begin, Kofi had done something different. He had survived. And now he was fighting back. Not loudly, not openly, but in a way that could not be ignored. The plantation owner soon became aware that something serious was happening. Reports reached him about the attacks, the missing tools, the growing fear among his overseers. At first he dismissed it, but when the third man disappeared completely, he could no longer ignore it. A search was organized. Armed men were sent into the swamp. Dogs were brought in to track movement. The plantation owner wanted this to end. He wanted control restored. But the swamp did not give up its secrets easily. The men who entered it found themselves slowed by mud and tangled roots. The deeper they went, the more difficult it became to follow any clear path. And just like the others before them, they found nothing. No sign of Kofi, no clear trail, only silence, and the feeling that they were not alone. Days passed. Then came another night. Another attack. This time it was different. One of the remaining men was found at the edge of the plantation, his body still, his weapon untouched beside him. There was no struggle, no sign of noise. Just the quiet end of a man who had once believed he was in control. Now only a few of the original 7 remained, and the fear among them had turned into something deeper. Regret. They began to speak among themselves about that night. The night they had taken Kofi to the tree. The night they had beaten him. The night they had left him in the swamp. They realized something they had not understood before. They had not ended him. They had changed him. They had taken a man who watched quietly and forced him into something else. Something sharper. Something more dangerous. By the time this realization settled in their minds, it was already too late. Because Kofi was no longer reacting. He was deciding. He chose when to appear. He chose when to strike. He chose when to disappear again into the swamp that had once nearly taken his life. The plantation owner eventually reduced the patrols, not because the danger was gone, but because the effort to find Kofi had failed again and again. The swamp had claimed him, or so they began to believe. But the truth was more unsettling. He had not been claimed. He had adapted. And somewhere within the dark, quiet wilderness beyond the fields, Kofi still moved. No longer a man bound by rope. No longer a man broken by force. But a man who had taken control of his own fate, and who had made sure that the 7 men who once thought they could leave him to die would carry the consequences of that night for the rest of their lives. Because some actions do not fade, they return. And when they do not ask for permission. They arrive when it is least expected, and they leave behind a lesson that cannot be forgotten. Time moved forward, but the fear did not leave the plantation. Even as days passed without an attack, the silence itself became unsettling. The men who remained from the original 7 could not relax. They listened to every sound at night, the movement of leaves, the shift of wind through the trees, even the distant cry of animals began to feel like warnings. Because they knew something the others did not. Kofi was still out there, waiting, watching. The plantation owner tried to restore order. He increased discipline among the workers, believing fear would force control back into place. Punishments became harsher. Patrols, though fewer, were more aggressive when they did move through the land. But control built on fear is fragile. And this time the fear was not one-sided. Among the enslaved workers, something had changed. They still worked under the same conditions. They still followed orders during the day. But at night, inside the quiet spaces where overseers could not hear, there was a shift in how they spoke. Kofi was no longer just a man. He had become a symbol. Not because of loud rebellion, but because of what he represented. He showed that survival was possible. He showed that knowledge of the land could be more powerful than chains. And most importantly, he showed that those who were meant to be broken could rise again in ways no one expected. The remaining men who had taken part in that night carried their fear openly now. They stayed close to the main house. They avoided the edges of the plantation. They avoided the swamp completely. But fear has a way of following. One evening, as the sun was setting and shadows stretched across the fields, one of them made a mistake. He stepped away from the group. Not far. Just enough. Just for a moment. That was all it took. The attack was quick. Silent. By the time others reached him, it was already over. No one saw what happened. But everyone understood. Now only a few remained. The number had fallen steadily, one by one, until the group that once stood together in strength had been reduced to individuals who barely trusted the ground beneath their feet. The plantation owner realized something he did not want to admit. This was no longer something he could control. The man they had tried to destroy had taken something from them: certainty. And without certainty, power begins to weaken. Eventually, the attack stopped. Not suddenly, not with a final moment, but slowly, as if the purpose had been completed. The remaining men lived on, but they were not the same. They moved carefully, spoke quietly, and never returned to the confidence they once carried. The swamp remained, silent, unchanged. But for them, it was no longer just part of the land. It was a reminder of what they had done and what had come back to find them. As for Kofi, no one could say for certain what became of him. Some believed he moved deeper into the wilderness, far beyond the reach of the plantation. Others believed he continued watching from a distance, making sure the lesson was never forgotten. And some said he simply became part of the swamp itself, a presence that could not be seen, but could always be felt. What remained was a story told quietly among those who understood its meaning. A story about a man who was tied, beaten, and left to die. A story about 7 men who believed their actions would end everything. And a story about how they learned, too late, that some things do not end the way you expect. Because the man they left behind did not disappear. He changed. And in that change, he took control of something they never thought they could lose. Their sense of safety, their sense of power, and their belief that they could act without consequence. In the end, the lesson was simple. What is done in cruelty does not always stay buried. Sometimes it waits, sometimes it grows, and sometimes it returns in a way that cannot be stopped. And by the time it does, it is already too late. Years passed, and the plantation in Louisiana slowly changed its appearance, but not its memory. New workers arrived. Old ones disappeared. Seasons came and went as the fields continued to produce, just as they always had. But some things do not fade with time. They settle. They remain. And they wait in the quiet spaces where history is not written, but remembered. Among the enslaved people, the story of Kofi did not disappear. It was not spoken loudly. It was not told in front of overseers or strangers. But at night, when the air grew still and voices dropped to whispers, the story continued. Not as a tale of fear, but as a lesson. They spoke about the man who had been taken, beaten, tied, and left for dead. They spoke about the night the swamp should have claimed him. And they spoke about what happened after. They did not always tell every detail. They did not need to, because the meaning of the story was clear. He had refused to stay broken. That alone was enough. The remaining overseers who had survived those nights never spoke openly about what had happened, but their behavior told the story. They no longer walked with the same authority. They no longer laughed as loudly, and they never again treated punishment as something without consequence. The memory followed them, in their sleep, in their silence, in the way they avoided certain parts of the land, especially the swamp, because to them that place was no longer just part of the plantation. It was where control had slipped, where power had changed direction, where a man they believed was finished had become something they could not face. Over time, even the plantation owner stopped asking questions. He understood something he could not explain. Whatever had happened out there was beyond his reach, beyond his authority, and beyond his control. The land held its secrets, and it was better in his mind to leave them buried. But stories like this are never truly buried. They move through time. They pass from one generation to another, sometimes changing in detail, but never losing their meaning. Long after slavery itself came to an end, after the chains were removed and the laws began to change, stories like Kofi's remained. Not because they were written in books, but because they were carried in memory. They became part of a larger truth about that time. A truth that is not always comfortable to face. That even in the harshest systems, resistance exists. Sometimes quietly, sometimes unseen, but always present. Kofi's story stands as one of those moments. A moment when a man who was meant to be an example of punishment became something else entirely. A reminder, a warning, and a symbol, not of revenge alone, but of transformation. He began as a man under control. He became a man beyond it. And in doing so, he left behind something more powerful than fear. He left behind understanding. Understanding that actions have consequences. Understanding that power is not absolute. And understanding that even those who seem powerless can change the direction of a story. As we come to the end of this journey, take a moment to reflect. Because this story is not only about the past, it is about what it reveals, about human strength, about survival, and about the quiet ways resistance can grow, even in the darkest places. The man they tied to a tree did not disappear. He became something they could never control again. And that is why his story remains, not written in official records, but carried in the silence of history, waiting to be told, and never forgotten. And even now, long after the fields have changed and the voices of that time have faded, the meaning of Kofi's story still remains. History does not always preserve names. It does not always record every life or every struggle. But it remembers moments. Moments where something shifts. Moments where the expected outcome does not happen. Moments where a person refuses to disappear. Kofi was one of those moments. In a system designed to erase identity, he became unforgettable. Not because he stood in the open, not because he led a crowd, but because he survived what was meant to end him. And then he changed what came after. What makes his story powerful is not only what he did, but how he did it. He did not rush. He did not react without thought. He waited. He observed. He understood. And then, when the time came, he acted in a way that could not be easily stopped. This is something that appears again and again in history. Resistance does not always come with noise. Sometimes it comes with patience. Sometimes it comes with silence. And sometimes it comes in forms that those in power do not expect. That is why it is so difficult to control. Because it does not follow rules. It does not announce itself. And it does not ask for permission. The 7 men believed they were ending a problem. They believed they were reinforcing control. They believed they could act without consequence. But what they created instead was something far more dangerous. They created awareness. They created change. And they created a story that would outlive them. Because stories like this do not stay in one place. They move. They spread. They become part of a larger understanding. An understanding that no system, no matter how powerful, is completely unbreakable. That even in the darkest conditions, people are still thinking, still observing, still waiting. And sometimes those who are underestimated become the ones who shift everything. Kofi's story reminds us of that. It reminds us that strength is not always visible, that power is not always loud, and that survival itself can be the beginning of resistance. As we close this story, think about what it represents. Not just a moment in history, but a pattern, a truth that repeats itself in different forms across time. That control is never complete, that silence is not always weakness, and that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who understands the most. The man they tied and left overnight did not disappear. He endured. He adapted. And he became something they could never predict. And in the end, that is why they regretted it. Because by the time they understood what they had done, the outcome was already beyond their control. And it was already too late. And as the years stretch even further into the distance, the story of Kofi settles into something deeper than memory. It becomes a reflection of how power behaves, a reflection of how resistance forms, and a reflection of how quickly the roles of control and fear can change. On that plantation in Louisiana, the land itself remained long after the people were gone. The trees still stood. The swamp still breathed in slow silence. The same paths that had once carried footsteps of overseers and enslaved workers became quiet again. But places remember. Not in words, not in records, but in presence. There are locations in history where something shifts so deeply that even time cannot fully erase it. That plantation became one of those places. Because it was there that something simple and brutal turned into something unexpected. 7 men believed they were enforcing control. But what they did revealed something they could not understand. That control built on cruelty has limits. And when those limits are crossed, the outcome can no longer be predicted. Kofi did not have power in the way they understood it. He had no weapon, no position, no protection. But he had awareness. And awareness, when combined with patience and survival, becomes something powerful. He understood the land. He understood the people. And most importantly, he understood timing. This is what allowed him to move differently, to act differently, to become something they could not stop. Even now, when stories like his are told, they are not always about the exact details. They are about the meaning behind them. They are about the moment when expectation fails, when the outcome does not follow the path that power believes it controls, and when the person who was meant to disappear becomes the one who changes everything. Kofi's story carries that meaning clearly. It reminds us that strength is not always what it appears to be, that silence does not mean weakness, and that survival can become transformation. The 7 men learned that lesson too late. By the time they understood what had happened, the balance had already shifted. They were no longer the ones creating fear. They were the ones living with it. And that is where the true change happened. Not in a single moment, but in the slow realization that power had moved. That control was no longer absolute, and that the man they left behind had taken something from them they could never fully recover. Their certainty. As we close this story completely, there is one final truth to carry with you. History is not only shaped by those who hold power, it is also shaped by those who endure it, those who study it, and those who find a way to move within it until the moment comes to change it. Kofi was one of those people. A man who was tied, a man who was left, a man who was expected to disappear. But instead, he remained. He changed. And he left behind a story that continues to speak long after his footsteps have faded. A story that reminds us all that sometimes the moment someone is counted out is the very moment they begin to rise. And by the time the world realizes it, the outcome is already sealed, and there is nothing left to do except face it. And even beyond the silence of that land, beyond the years that erased faces and names, the story continues in another way. Not just as history, but as a question that follows every story like this. What truly gives a person power? Is it position? Is it control? Is it force? Or is it something deeper? Something that cannot be taken, even when everything else is stripped away. Kofi's story answers that question without ever speaking it directly, because everything that should have ended him was already in place. He was outnumbered. He was beaten. He was tied. He was left in a place where survival itself was uncertain. By every expectation, his story should have ended that night, but it did not. And that is where the meaning begins. Because when someone survives what is meant to destroy them, they do not return as the same person. They return with clarity, with awareness, with a deeper understanding of both themselves and the system around them. That is what changed in Kofi. The swamp did not just hide him. It reshaped him. It gave him space to think, to observe, to decide. And once that decision was made, everything that followed was no longer random. It was intentional. That is why the 7 men could not stop it, because they were reacting, and he was choosing. This difference, small at first, became everything. It turned the hunted into the one who understood the hunt. It turned fear into something that moved in a different direction. And it turned a single moment of cruelty into a lasting shift in power. This is what makes stories like this endure. Not just because of what happened, but because of what they reveal. They reveal that control has limits. They reveal that silence can hold strength. And they reveal that even in the most controlled conditions, the human mind is still active, still learning, still preparing. Kofi did not need recognition. He did not need to be remembered by name in records or books. Because what he did moved beyond that. It became part of a pattern that appears wherever people are pushed too far. Where survival becomes resistance, and where resistance becomes transformation. So when you think about this story, do not only think about the night he was left behind. Think about what happened after. Think about the shift. Think about the moment when expectation broke. Because that moment exists in many places across history. And each time it appears, it carries the same message. That power is never as complete as it believes. That control is never as permanent as it seems. And that sometimes the person who is counted out becomes the one who changes everything. Kofi was that person. And by the time the 7 men understood it, there was nothing left for them to do, except live with the outcome they had created. Because some actions do not end when they are done. They begin. And once they begin, they move forward in ways no one can fully control. That is the final truth of this story. And that is why it will always be remembered, not just as a story of what happened, but as a reminder of what is always possible. And as the story settles into its final silence, what remains is not just what happened, but what it means. Because stories like this do not end with the last moment. They echo. They stay. They return in the thoughts of those who hear them. Kofi's story is one of those echoes. Not loud. Not written in official records. But strong enough to remain. Strong enough to travel through time without needing to be carried by books or names. Because its truth is simple and powerful. He was expected to disappear, but he did not. That single truth changes everything. It changes how we understand power. It changes how we understand survival. And it changes how we understand resistance. Because in a system built to erase people, survival itself becomes a form of defiance. And defiance, even when quiet, has consequences. The 7 men believed their actions would end a problem. They believed they could act without thought of what would follow. But what followed was not something they could control. It was not something they could stop. Because once something shifts inside a person, once awareness replaces fear, there is no way to return to what existed before. That is the point where change begins. Not outside, but inside. Kofi reached that point in the darkness of the swamp. And once he did, everything that came after was shaped by it. That is why his story does not need an ending in the usual sense. Because it is not about where he went. It is not about what happened to him in the years after. It is about what he became in that moment, and what that becoming meant for everyone around him. The plantation continued. The fields remained. The system carried on for a time, but something had already been altered. Something that could not be undone. Because once people see that resistance is possible, even in the smallest form, the idea does not disappear. It stays. It grows. And it waits. That is the quiet power behind stories like this. They do not need to shout. They do not need to be repeated loudly. They exist beneath the surface, shaping how people think, how they see the world, and how they understand what is possible. Kofi's story carries that kind of power. It reminds us that the moment someone is pushed to their limit can also be the moment they begin to rise. It reminds us that being underestimated can become an advantage. And it reminds us that even in the darkest situations, the human spirit is still capable of change. So as you walk away from this story, carry that with you, not just as something that happened in the past, but as something that explains a deeper truth. That power is never complete, that control is never final, and that sometimes the quietest resistance creates the strongest impact. Because in the end, the man they tied and left behind did not vanish. He became something they could not undo. And that is why their regret came too late, and why the story never truly ends. And even after everything has been said, there is still one final layer to the story. A layer that sits quietly beneath the surface. Because what happened to Kofi was not just an event. It was a turning point. A moment where something invisible shifted. Not only in him, but in the space around him. The plantation did not collapse that day. The system did not end that night. But something inside it cracked. A small fracture. One that could not be seen at first. But one that changed how everything rested above it. That is how change often begins. Not with loud moments, but with quiet breaks in what was once certain. The 7 men believed in certainty. They believed in their control. They believed in their ability to decide outcomes. But that belief was built on something fragile. It was built on the idea that those beneath them would remain predictable, remain fearful, remain still. Kofi broke that pattern. And when a pattern breaks, everything connected to it begins to shift. That is why their fear did not come all at once. It came slowly. It grew. It settled into their actions, their thoughts, their sleep, until it became part of how they lived. That is the true weight of consequence. Not just what happens, but what stays. And what stays cannot be undone. Kofi did not need to speak. He did not need to explain. Because what he became was already understood. A presence. A reminder. A change that could not be reversed. And that is why the story continues to hold meaning. Because it shows something that is easy to overlook. That control is not only challenged by force, it is challenged by awareness, by patience, by the refusal to remain what others expect you to be. Kofi was expected to break, but he adapted. He was expected to disappear, but he remained. And in that, he changed the outcome. Not just for himself, but for everyone connected to that moment. That is the final truth of this story. Not the fear, not the revenge, but the shift. The moment where expectation ended and something else began. Something that could not be predicted. Something that could not be controlled. And something that could not be undone. So when you think back on the story, remember that. Not just the events, but the meaning behind them. Because history is filled with moments like this. Moments where everything appears to be settled. Until suddenly it is not. Moments where someone is counted out. Until they are not. And moments where what seems like an ending becomes something entirely different. Kofi's story is one of those moments. A quiet turning point. A hidden shift. A reminder that even in the most controlled situations, change is always possible. And once it begins, there is no stopping where it will lead. And that is where this story truly lives. Not in the past, but in the truth it leaves behind.